Every country on Earth is drowning in debt. The United States, $38 trillion. Japan, $10 trillion. China, untold trillions hidden in local government bonds. The entire planet owes $315 trillion, nearly 3.5 times global GDP. But here's the question that should keep you up at night. If everyone owes money, who exactly gets paid? The answer is more disturbing than you think. Because when you trace the chain of creditors back to its source, when you follow the money to see who actually holds the debt, you discover something chilling. The world doesn't owe money to some external force. It owes money to itself. But the system was designed this way, deliberately, by 4 men across 3 centuries who understood one simple truth. The person who controls the debt controls everything. They built a machine where debt can never be repaid, where governments must borrow forever, where interest flows eternally upward, and where every crisis, every bailout, every financial panic makes the architects of the system richer. This isn't conspiracy theory. This is documented historical fact. The meetings happened. The legislation passed. The mechanisms are public record. And once you understand how they built it, you'll see why 38 trillion isn't a crisis to be solved. It's the system working exactly as intended. Let me show you the 4 architects, the 4 moments when the debt trap was engineered, and why every government on Earth is now caught inside it with no way out. Before 1694, monarchs borrowed money the primitive way. A king needed funds for war. He'd approach wealthy merchants or nobles, promise repayment with interest, and hope for the best. If he couldn't pay, he'd default. The lenders lost their money. The king moved on to the next creditor. It was risky for lenders and humiliating for kings. But it was contained. Debt was temporary, either repaid or defaulted. The system cleared itself. Then William Paterson changed everything. Paterson was a Scottish merchant and financial opportunist who'd failed at multiple schemes to get rich. But in 1691, he had an idea that would alter the course of civilization. England was at war with France. King William III desperately needed money. The treasury was empty. Tax revenues couldn't cover war costs. And traditional lenders were refusing new loans because England had a history of defaults. Paterson approached the king with an offer that seemed too good to be true. He would organize a group of wealthy merchants to lend the government £1.2 million, roughly 300 million in today's money. A staggering sum. But here's the innovation that would change everything. The loan would never be repaid. Instead of paying back the principal, the government would simply pay interest forever. 8% annually, guaranteed. And to manage this perpetual arrangement, Paterson proposed creating an entirely new institution, the Bank of England. The mechanics were revolutionary. The merchant lenders would deposit their gold with the Bank of England. The bank would lend it to the government. The government would pay annual interest funded by tax revenue. The bank would distribute that interest to the merchants. But, and this is critical, the government would never repay the principal. Ever. The loan was permanent by design. Why would merchants accept this? 2 reasons. First, the interest payment was guaranteed by Parliament and backed by the government's power to tax its citizens. As long as England could collect taxes, the interest would flow. Second, the banknotes the merchants received in exchange for their gold were tradable. They functioned as currency, better than currency, actually, because they earned interest. Parliament approved Paterson's scheme in 1694. The Bank of England was chartered. The merchants provided their gold. The government received its war funding. And for the first time in human history, national debt became permanent. Not a problem to solve. A feature of the system. Here's what textbooks don't tell you about why this was brilliant for the bankers. The government paid 8% interest on £1.2 million annually. That's £96,000 per year. Forever. The merchants had purchased an annuity from the government. As long as England existed and could tax its population, the money flowed. And if they wanted liquidity, they could sell the banknotes to someone else. The debt was transferable, but never repayable. But Paterson's real genius was the next part. The Bank of England was granted the right to issue banknotes backed by the government's debt. They could print paper money up to the value of the loan. This created money from debt. The government's IOU became currency. And the more the government borrowed, the more money could be created. This is the template that still governs the world today. Government borrows, never repays the principal, pays interest forever, and the debt itself becomes money. It's brilliant if you're a banker. It's catastrophic if you're a taxpayer, because you're paying interest on debt that will never, ever disappear. Within 50 years, every major European power copied the model. France established similar institutions. The Netherlands formalized government debt issuance. And by 1790, the newly independent United States adopted the same system. Alexander Hamilton explicitly modeled America's financial system on the Bank of England. Permanent debt. interest paid from taxes, bonds traded as currency. Paterson died in 1719, not particularly wealthy despite founding the Bank of England. But the system he created? It's still here. 331 years later, the Bank of England still exists. British government debt has never been paid off. It's been refinanced, rolled over, expanded, but never eliminated. The debt trap was set in 1694, and every government since has walked into it willingly. By the early 1800s, European governments had embraced debt. They borrowed for wars, infrastructure, and operating expenses. But there was no organized market. Each loan was negotiated individually. Interest rates varied wildly. Only the wealthiest merchants could participate. Nathan Rothschild changed that. He industrialized sovereign debt. The Rothschild family began as money changers in Frankfurt. By 1800, the five Rothschild brothers had established banking houses in five major European cities: London, Paris, Frankfurt, Vienna, and Naples. This network was unprecedented. They could move money and information across borders faster than anyone else in history. Nathan Rothschild, operating from London, was the strategic mastermind. During the Napoleonic Wars, Nathan arranged loans for the British government. But his innovation wasn't the lending itself, it was how he structured the deals. Instead of lending directly to the government, he would purchase government bonds at a discount and then resell them to investors at a markup. He created the secondary market for sovereign debt. Here's how it worked. The government needed money immediately. Rothschild provided it up front. Then he sold the bonds to pension funds, insurance companies, and wealthy individuals across Europe. The government got fast cash. Rothschild collected the spread, and investors received a tradable asset that paid interest. But here's where it gets darker. Rothschild didn't just finance governments. He positioned himself so governments had no choice but to use him. The most famous example, the Battle of Waterloo in 1815. Nathan Rothschild learned of Napoleon's defeat before anyone else in London. His courier network, using carrier pigeons and fast ships, was superior to official government channels. According to historical accounts, he used this information to manipulate the bond market. He began selling British bonds, signaling to the market that Britain was losing. Prices collapsed. Other investors panicked and sold. Then, once prices had crashed, Rothschild bought massive quantities of bonds at rock-bottom prices. When official news of British victory arrived the next day, bond prices surged. Rothschild made a fortune, not from insider trading as we'd call it today, but from controlling information and market timing. This established the Rothschild model: control the information, control the issuance, control the market. By 1825, the Rothschilds dominated European sovereign debt. If a government needed to borrow, it went through the Rothschilds, because the Rothschilds controlled the investor network, had the distribution channels, and set the terms. Here's why this matters for understanding the modern debt trap. Before Rothschild, a government could theoretically refuse to pay. If a king defaulted, his creditors lost money and the system would eventually reset. But Rothschild made sovereign debt tradable across international borders. A British bond might be owned by a French investor, who sold it to a German bank, who used it as collateral for a loan to an Austrian nobleman. The web of ownership became so complex that defaulting wasn't just refusing to pay one creditor. It was collapsing an entire international financial network. This is the Rothschild innovation. Make debt so interconnected that default becomes impossible. Not because governments are responsible, but because default would trigger systemic collapse. Governments became trapped. They had to keep paying, and they had to keep borrowing to pay the interest on old debts. The debt trap was no longer just permanent, it was inescapable. The Rothschild family's wealth peaked in the mid-1800s. They were arguably the richest family in the world, wealthier than most monarchs. And that wealth came from one source: interest on sovereign debt. They didn't manufacture products. They didn't build infrastructure. They lent money to governments and collected interest. Forever. The system Paterson created in 1694, Rothschild industrialized and globalized by 1815. And every government in Europe was caught in the web. By 1900, America was becoming an economic superpower. But its financial system was primitive compared to Europe. Banks operated independently. The money supply was rigidly tied to gold. And there was no central mechanism to manage credit or debt. J.P. Morgan fixed that, not for the public good, but to protect his banking empire. In 1907, a severe financial panic struck. Stock prices crashed. Banks failed. The economy seized up. J.P. Morgan personally organized a bailout. He gathered the most powerful bankers in New York at his private library, locked the doors, and forced them to pledge their own money to stabilize failing institutions. It worked. The panic subsided, and Morgan became the de facto central banker of the United States. But he was 70 years old. He knew he couldn't do it again. So Morgan and his associates, the most powerful financiers in America, designed a permanent solution. They needed a central bank. But there was a problem. Americans hated central banks. The first and second banks of the United States had both been shut down due to populist opposition. So Morgan's circle disguised it. In November 1910, Senator Nelson Aldrich and representatives from the nation's largest banks held a secret meeting on Jekyll Island, Georgia. For 9 days, they designed what would become the Federal Reserve System. The meeting was conducted in secrecy because they knew that if the public discovered bankers were designing the nation's monetary system, there would be outrage. The plan they created was a masterpiece of political camouflage. The Federal Reserve wouldn't be called a central bank, it would be called a Federal Reserve System. It wouldn't be one institution, it would be 12 regional banks, giving the appearance of decentralization. It wouldn't be controlled by Wall Street, it would be overseen by a board of governors appointed by the president. It looked democratic, public-minded, and decentralized. But the structure ensured banker control. The regional Federal Reserve banks were privately owned by member banks. Those member banks elected the boards of the regional feds. And the most important power, the power to create money and purchase government bonds, was concentrated in the Federal Reserve Bank of New York, which was controlled by the largest Wall Street banks, Morgan's banks. The Federal Reserve Act passed Congress in December 1913, largely because most representatives didn't fully understand what they were voting for. And immediately, the debt trap expanded. Now the government didn't just borrow from private banks, it borrowed from the Federal Reserve, which could create money to buy government bonds. Unlimited demand for government debt. Here's why this changed everything. Before the Federal Reserve, there was a practical limit to how much the government could borrow. Banks only had so much capital to lend. But the Federal Reserve could create money by purchasing government bonds. The government issues a bond. The Fed buys it with newly created money. The government spends the money. And the debt goes onto the Fed's balance sheet, backed by nothing except the promise that taxpayers will service it forever. This is the mechanism that enables infinite debt. The Federal Reserve ensures there's always a buyer for government bonds. Always demand. So the government never has to stop borrowing. It can roll over debt indefinitely because the Fed will always purchase more. And the interest payments? They flow from taxpayers to the banks that own shares in the Federal Reserve System. Morgan died in 1913, the same year the Federal Reserve was created. But his legacy is the structure that makes the current $38 trillion in U.S. debt possible. Without the Federal Reserve, the government couldn't borrow at this scale. The market wouldn't support it. But with the Fed as a guaranteed buyer, there is no limit. The debt trap became infinite. By the 1970s, the debt trap Patterson, Rothschild, and Morgan built was functioning across the developed world. Every industrialized nation borrowed, rolled over debt, and paid interest perpetually. But developing nations were different. They borrowed heavily for infrastructure projects, but many struggled to keep up with payments. The debt trap was reaching its natural limits, until Paul Volcker made it permanent and global. Volcker was Federal Reserve Chairman from 1979 to 1987, and he faced a serious problem. Inflation was spiraling out of control, exceeding 10%. U.S. economic credibility was eroding. Foreign governments were losing faith in the dollar. Volcker needed to crush inflation, even if it meant triggering a recession. So in 1979, he raised interest rates dramatically. The federal funds rate went from 11% to over 20%, the highest in American history. This policy successfully broke inflation, but it had another devastating effect. Developing nations had borrowed hundreds of billions of dollars during the 1970s when interest rates were low. Now those loans were coming due, and interest rates had tripled. Mexico owed $80 billion. Brazil owed $60 billion. Argentina owed $40 billion. And they couldn't pay. The interest alone exceeded their export revenues. In August 1982, Mexico announced it could not make its debt payments. Default. This should have triggered a global financial collapse. American banks had lent most of that money. If Mexico defaulted, Citibank, Bank of America, and Chase Manhattan would all take catastrophic losses. Some might fail entirely. The entire banking system was at risk. Volcker could have let it happen. Let the banks take their losses. Let the market clear and reset. But he didn't. Instead, he orchestrated a bailout through the International Monetary Fund. The IMF would lend Mexico, Brazil, Argentina, and other nations enough money to keep making interest payments to American banks. The loans were called structural adjustment loans, but they came with brutal conditions. Governments had to slash public spending, privatize state-owned assets, open their markets to foreign investment, devalue their currencies, essentially dismantle their economic sovereignty in exchange for the money to keep paying interest to foreign banks. And here's the key. The IMF loans didn't reduce the debt. They just rolled it over, made it manageable, but permanent. This is the Volcker innovation. When debt becomes unpayable, don't forgive it. Restructure it. Lend just enough to keep interest payments flowing, and extract political and economic concessions in exchange. The debt trap became a tool of control. Countries that couldn't pay were forced to open their economies, sell their national assets, and submit to foreign economic policies, all for the privilege of staying in debt. This pattern has repeated for 40 years. Greece in 2010, Argentina in 2001, Sri Lanka in 2022. Every time, the same structure. IMF loans to keep paying creditors. Austerity imposed. Sovereignty surrendered. And the debt never eliminated, just restructured into perpetual obligation. Volcker died in 2019, but his legacy is the mechanism that ensures the debt trap is global and inescapable. Even when countries can't pay, they're not allowed to default. They're refinanced into permanent indebtedness, and the interest keeps flowing to the creditors. The same institutions, the same system Patterson created in 1694. Now let me show you how these four architects built a system where debt is infinite and escape is structurally impossible. Start with Patterson's template. Government borrows, pays interest forever, never repays principal. Add Rothschild's innovation. Make the debt tradable globally, so it's not one creditor, but an interconnected web. Default doesn't just hurt one lender, it collapses the entire system. Add Morgan's mechanism. Central banks create money to buy government bonds, ensuring unlimited demand. The government can always borrow more. Add Volcker's trap. When countries can't pay, restructure instead of forgiving. Keep the interest flowing. Use debt as leverage to extract concessions. The result is what we have today. $315 trillion in global debt. Government debt, corporate debt, household debt. None of it will ever be repaid. All of it pays interest. And all of it is interconnected through the financial system. So default anywhere threatens collapse everywhere. Here's the specific mechanism for the United States. The U.S. government has issued $38 trillion in debt. Who owns it? About $26 trillion is owned domestically. Pension funds, mutual funds, insurance companies, banks, and the Federal Reserve itself. These institutions buy treasury bonds because they're considered safe assets. But those bonds pay interest. Approximately $1 trillion per year. That interest comes from taxes. Taxpayers send money to the government. The government sends it to bondholders. The bondholders are mostly institutions owned by or benefiting the wealthy. It's a transfer of wealth from workers to capital. Every year. Forever. The remaining $12 trillion is owned by foreign governments and institutions. Japan, China, and others hold U.S. debt as reserves. Now scale this globally. Japan owes $10 trillion, mostly to Japanese institutions and the Bank of Japan. Europe collectively owes $15 trillion to European banks and the ECB. China's debt is harder to measure, but likely exceeds $10 trillion when local government obligations are included. Every country is running the same system, and they're all interconnected. Japan holds U.S. treasuries. The U.S. participates in IMF loans to developing nations. Europe holds developing nation debt through various international institutions. It's circular. Everyone owes everyone, and the interest flows upward to the institutions that manage and hold the debt. Here's why this system can never be dismantled. If the U.S. government paid off its $38 trillion in debt, the money supply would collapse. Because in our current system, dollars are created when the government borrows. If the debt were paid off, those dollars would vanish. Deflation, depression, economic collapse. So the government can never pay off the debt. It must keep borrowing, keep rolling it over, and keep paying interest. The same is true globally. If every government paid off its debt simultaneously, the global money supply would shrink by more than half. There wouldn't be enough currency to conduct international trade. The system would seize. Debt can't be eliminated. It's structural, necessary by design. And here's who profits. The institutions that hold the debt. BlackRock, Vanguard, State Street, Fidelity. These asset management giants control tens of trillions in assets. They buy government bonds with other people's money, pension funds, retirement accounts, insurance premiums. And they collect the interest. Nearly $1 trillion per year from U.S. debt alone, plus interest from Japan, Europe, everywhere. That $1 trillion in annual interest payments flows from taxpayers to bondholders. It's the largest continuous wealth transfer in history. And it's invisible to most people because it's not called a tax. It's called debt service. But functionally, it's the same thing. Workers pay, institutions collect, and the debt never decreases. Now here's the final piece that brings it all together. The four architects didn't conspire together. They lived centuries apart, but each one solved an immediate problem in a way that served the interests of finance. and each solution built on the previous one, creating a system that now governs the entire world. Patterson made debt permanent in 1694. Rothschild made it global and interconnected in 1815. Morgan made it infinite in 1913. Volcker made it inescapable in 1982. Together, they constructed a machine where governments borrow forever, pay interest eternally, and can never break free. The people who control the bonds, who manage the debt, who collect the interest, they are the ultimate beneficiaries. Not governments, not citizens, the financial institutions. And here's the final truth. 38 trillion in US debt isn't a crisis for them. It's a business model. Every dollar of debt is an asset on someone's balance sheet. It generates interest. It provides collateral for additional borrowing. And as long as confidence holds, as long as people believe governments will pay interest even if they never repay the principal, the system functions perfectly. The debt trap is complete. An escape isn't possible without collapsing the entire global financial system. For architects, 3 centuries, one system, and every person on Earth is now caught inside it. If this changed how you see government debt, if you finally understand that 38 trillion isn't an accident or a mistake, but a system working exactly as designed, then you're beginning to see how financial power actually operates. Subscribe if you want to understand how the machine was built and who benefits from it. Because they're not going to teach you this in economics class. They'll teach you that debt is a problem to be managed or solved. But the architects knew better. Debt isn't a problem. It's the foundation. And interest is the rent we all pay to live in their system.